Okay, so my presentation is about macro problems and micro solutions. I mean, solutions, sometimes small solutions are efficient for big problems. First, I'm going to give you some context regarding macros, how we got here. Also, I'm going to talk about some attacks, curiosities, and statistics regarding how macros work. And finally, some small solutions, but that in the end are efficient. I'm Sergio de los Santos, and before starting with my presentation, I would like to explain what an office macro is. I'm sure that you've heard about macros before, but to sum up, the macros involve introducing executable codes in an Office document. So Office has an execution driver with a VBA macros language, and this is used with legitimate purpose, but also with attacking purposes. There are more malicious macros than legitimate macros, and they are used to automatize Excel and Word processes, to access databases, and they are very powerful. You can do anything with them, so also attackers can do anything with the macros that are integrated in or embedded in the documents. So macros for Word and Excel, which are the most popular ones, are executable code that is used when you launch a document. So this is why it is so dangerous to launch documents via email, for example. So this is so dangerous that some years, not that many years ago, they published that 45% of attacks were done by Office macros and 37% attack through CVE 2017-11882. This is a problem when processing equations in Word. The engine that processes equations exceeds the power of the buffer, and when you double click, it starts executing code. So about almost 80% of problems through which malware can be introduced in systems is Office. So these are other graphs that explain how much things have changed. In 2016, the highest number of attacks came from navigators, up to 45%, while in 2018, about 70% of attacks were coming through Office documents, through macros or vulnerabilities such as the equation vulnerability. In 2016, this amount accounted for about 16%, and this has increased. Why? Because, well, in 2013, Java, for example, accounted for almost the whole pie, but now it's not that important. Also, browsers in 2016 were also the most popular attack, or Adobe Flash, for example, PDF were causing more problems. Treatbug, Ryuk, all these things arrive through Office macros. So one of the biggest problems that we have right now are caused by just opening an Office documents, and local governments have been attacked, for example, through these resources. And well, why macros are so widely spread? Well, they are easy to hide, they are legitimate, and the user usually enables these macros, even though they are disabled by default. And so we are going to see the tricks that they use in order for the user to enable these macros. They are more complex, even though some sandboxes can be used, but it is more, they are complex to emulate. They are usually sent by spam, and at the server level, this is analyzed statically, and this type of analysis can avoid antivirus very easily. Also, opening an Excel or a document may be as dangerous as clicking on an executable program. And the attackers can only use this method in order to attack. Browsers, Adobe, Java are not a way of introducing these type of viruses, so an email is the best option for them. We don't know what they will use tomorrow, but this is what they are doing right now. So I'm going to explain where the macros are. If you open a docx document, and the typical 2013 documents, you will see that there is a zip with a lot of XML documents. And if you have macros here, you will see a bin point. I mean, .bin, and this is where everything that a macro needs to execute. If we click on .bin, which is a zip and can be opened with the zip program, you will see that inside there is a project and a folder VBA, which is the code in which macros are written. And if we click inside the VBA through all a browser, we will see that there are flows, macros, etc. I mean, this is a project such as .NET. You have to compile it, execute it. We will see this later. So, well, as I was saying, it has a configuration file project with the engine. Office has the engine. Engine is going to interpret and execute the commands. Dir has the layout of the project, because this is a programming project. Then the streams of the modules, depending on the number of macros. And then there is something called performance cache, which we'll see later, and compressed source code. This is very important. I don't know if you've seen a macro. I will show you a video later, but if you open a macro with Office, you will, I mean, if you open Office, there is a tab that writes macros, and you can see the source code of the macros, not just the compiling item, but also the source code. And why? Because probably as Microsoft wants to offer compatibility with previous versions, if you launch a macro compiled for an engine and you open it with a different version engine, this is going to compile the code for you. So that helps the infection to spread. And as there are different VBA engines, if you open a macro 2016 in a 2013 Office, you are going to be able to do it because of the compilation process. And this is why the source code is also embedded. There are many different type of documents, and also because of everlasting compatibility, we're going to see that there are different types of documents that coexist. For example, OpenXML is the current type of document, which is later than 2007, and the extensions end up in X. These are zipped documents that have an object and an XML configuration. Before, the classical doc was something that was not easy to understand. That was an object in itself with a binary. When a document had inside macros, the macro was another document embedded, and this allowed you to navigate through the document, but it was not so easy because it was not something standard. There are more formats, even though they are not as famous, and that have emerged again because attackers are using them in order to hide their intentions. So this is a weird format because the name is similar to Office XML, but it is not Open XML, the previous one that we've seen. Microsoft invented a format called Open XML, which is not the same as the one that we've seen before, Microsoft Office XML. For example, in Wikipedia, you can take this format XML. This is just plain text. You can paste it here in a document. You can keep it, and if you change the name to .doc, so it opens the Office as if it was a document. If you want to change the format, you can do it here, and it will keep on being a document. But now, I think I'm trying to open it.
So I converted it to a new document. It moved from the doc format to zip. This is a known format, and in order to introduce macros, you need to add a base 64 because it is binary, and it is that bin point is encrypted in base 64. I saved it in the older format, and as you can see, it is binary, so you cannot understand anything. There are other many formats where you can add macros in an attempt to alert the user. When a document had a macros several years ago, Office renamed it as DocM, which means document with macros, with a small alert. The problem is that it also needs to recognize .doc. So you remove the M or you add an X, and then you don't get that alert, so it's useless. There are other kinds of macros which can be included in templates, and each of them has its own format. So like modern template, older template, there are many macros. As for macros malware, between 1997 and 2003 it was quite popular. Melissa, for the older ones, was a malware that affected 20% of people. It would send you a document, you would open it, and the macro would take a look at your contacts, and it was resent to itself. At that moment, there was no security. Macros were executed by default, only by opening the document, which is something crazy today. So there was no awareness on security 20 years ago, and they were using Windows XP and backwards. From 2003 to 2013, no one was using the macro malware in order to perform attacks, but at a certain point, maybe in 2003, a functionality was implemented. Macros were not executed by default. You would get a warning in order to know whether you wanted to execute it or not. And since it was easier to do it in another way. This way was forgotten. However, in 2014, this malware came into force again due to the fact that computers were awful in terms of security. Java was awful and the others as well. So attackers found in macros and in social engineering, being the user the most vulnerable one, a formula that has been successful since 2014. Here, I'm going to show you the graph. There is an additional thing. PowerShell starts to be ubiquitous. They detect that from macros they can call PowerShell. It is important for PowerShell to be ubiquitous because it can execute many things without affecting the disk. And if you do not affect the disk, you are not going to be detected by antivirus. So the combination of macro and PowerShell became very powerful since 2014. These Microsoft graphs show the moment when somebody detected the power of macros and the telemetrics soared. There you have the link. We're going to see some curious formulas that show the evolution of attackers in order to hide macros. First, social engineering. As it is activated by default, the attacker is hoping that the user activates it. And in order to do so, they use different techniques. They send instructions to activate macros for that document. All the times they say this document is protected, so you have to enable macros in order to get infected. And others say that the Office version is not supported. Another one is that the file is encrypted, and clicking on the link you will decode it. So everything is done in order to enable macros. Also enable macros because your encryption is not good and you cannot see the important information on the document. Here the document is blurry, so if you click on the button you will see it perfectly clear. There are several techniques. These are the most elegant ones, which are infecting several victims. Simply, they say, I need admin privileges, which should already tell you that this is suspicious, in order to enable the macros in the end. Here it says, in order to activate Office, you need to enable macros. There is a Twitter by this famous Twitter account that says, why would you name the infect my computer button enable macros? Just say infect me. Another curious point about this macro, I think there was an Asian country where attackers took the macros. You can see it says enable content, so to extract the macros from its typical location. This document had some white pages and then something weird. If you zoomed it, because the font is tiny, it leads you to a code in base 64, which is a binary, which in the end will infect you. But it was written in the document, not in the macro itself. In addition to this, they used another format called HTML, which is like an HTML, and if you rename it as a doc, it also works as one. In this video, I take the document that I left over there before, I drag it here, it is in binary format, I open it in Word, and I'm going to save it as AIM-HTML, which is a format I wasn't familiar with. It's useful to create websites through Word. As you can see, the icon is changed, and I will just say it is a doc. So it transforms into a doc, and I can add macros to that doc. Therefore, these people had created a macros which was taking the content of the document and it executed a code. You see that the normal format is HTML. So, and it opens it with Microsoft Explorer instead of Microsoft Edge due to backward compatibility. I brought a video on, I don't know if you will be able to see it. Well, it's a bit small, but for HTML format, you have a program that opens the macro and it was writing on the registry. Even if it was HTML, in the end, it was a document with macros, and it has the code in order to decode the 64 base. This was discovered in order to use malware. It is velvet sweatshop. It is a magical word in Office. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I don't know if you know it. It is a password which was introduced by manufacturers of Office, so that if you created a document and protected it with that password, it was like having no password. It is embedded, and it is like a joke password. I don't know if you have ever protected with password an Excel document. You can do it in here in settings. You click on options and you say, I want the reading mode to be protected. So I copy and paste the password velvet sweatshop for the reading mode, and I save the Excel. So when I'm opening the Excel document again, it opens it without any problems. If I save it again with any other password, maybe I can add a letter to this velvet sweatshop. Okay, accept. So I'm opening the Excel again. Well, first you need to close it. So now they're going to ask me that password. So attackers have been using that password in order to hide themselves. Anti-attackers usually use passwords, but they are included in the email of the on the email. So they send you a document and with the password on the email, and that's the way they get to not to be detected by antivirus, because the antivirus cannot open the document without that password. This is another thing about Excel 4.0, which were XLM macros, very old macros which are still compatible, although I think they are only used by attackers. It is easier to perform than it looks like. Basically, you need to type here whatever you want, and this calls the virtual opt. It's wonderful because you do not affect the disk. You create an object in memory, you have the executable here, and you type in this part of the memory, and you create the thread. So it is already launched. So when you open an executable, then when you're opening an Excel, you are going to execute it. This was quite simple, so I was quite shocked, and I decided to try it with PowerShell. So this is the format for the macro. In this video, what I did was to, I think you cannot see it, but I was calling PowerShell, which was calling a URL, and when I opened this simple Excel, the system executed the PowerShell, and this was not detected by many antiviruses, and it was executing code. You see the code there. Another, these were techniques, and now I'm going to talk about some curious attacks that caught my attention.
No voy muy bien de tiempo, voy a pasar de esta. Aquí había una macro, tenía ahí una macro para OpenOffice.
I had a macro for OpenOffice. Recently, it was discovered that when you were disabling the Mac, it wasn't being disabled. So they cannot get rid of macros. There is another curious technique that I discovered in my study, which is to add many comments on the code, such as this one. These ones make no sense. Others do make sense. They are complete words which are there to get victims distracted. Some of those codes had plenty of Microsoft URLs, for example, in order to get people distracted. Other techniques is to use the Power Creator in PowerShell, through which you can create whatever you want. And if you add it to Metasploit in order to do an adequate payload, it works quite fine. You just have to launch the exploit, you invoke the macro, and then you can do things like this. Without knowing nothing, you can do things like this. You call the kernel functions, such as stealing passwords and so on, and everything is created in a simple way, with many functionalities which want to do evil. For example, obfuscations, and all the formulas you have to launch code are considered in this attack because they distract antivirus. And you can have macros where you add a huge piece of code which in the end is an executable, but they need to obfuscate it somehow. And this was done through Empire Framework. Another crazy thing that we discovered is that ribbons, those deployable menus on a panel which have a square form, they have hidden in those ribbons, because you can create ribbons with macro, and they have managed to do that. Update ribbon database enables you to update ribbon database thus creating a macro. When you open it, it thus a callback in the layout of the HTML of the macro, and in the end it injected you this code, this malicious code. This was not like a macro, but like an update of the ribbon. Hard work. Another thing is that they haven't tried to hide the code everywhere, as VBA has visual elements. You can open a window with a point net, you can create buttons, you can create events. One of the things they have done is to hide in the properties of the graphic elements, not within the code itself. They want to avoid the code in any way. They can do it. In this video, I have a virtual machine. This is a demonstration that tells you click on enable contact, then I get infected, and then I'm going to go to the macro menu where you can see the code, because as I said, the code is attached to it. The source code is very difficult to understand because it is quite obfuscated, but I was looking for something that it is always present, which is a shell or PowerShell or execute. Since I couldn't find it, I started looking for shell, and then it says that in alternative text it launches something. I went crazy by looking for this alternative text. So I copied and pasted from this cover flow a module that iterated through some elements. I iterated through the alternative text in order to find it, because I couldn't find it. So I am executing it step by step, and in an alternative text whose location I couldn't find, there was a PowerShell. So it was hidden there, but it was obfuscated. And then this is another example in the video. There is a similar example, because I realized it was more common than it was thought. I go to the macros menu, auto open, which opens it directly, and then I searched alternative, and here it is. There is a shell, an alternative, a replace, replace of an bracket for an A, and I inserted the 4 in order to pass by all the alternatives, and then I could see PowerShell, but it was obfuscated because it is full of brackets and so on. It is quite crazy, but it is what attackers are using to infect nowadays. One of the examples caught my attention. It was the only time I could see this kind of attack, which is there was a macro which was hidden. It was not obfuscated. It was under camouflage. As you understand, as you can see, you can barely understand what this code is, but this did quite the opposite. First of all, in some part of the text of a property of a graphic element, there was a call for an executable. And then the code that processed that executable was quite readable, and it seemed real. You have currency, connected users, constant problems. It seemed completely real, but when you debug it, it was sending commands such as this one, calling a shell in order to be executed. So it was being hidden behind a apparent real code. And there was a change from feet to centimeters, but in the end, behind that code, there was a call for the executable in order to make the codes seem legitimate. Problems do it. Problems do it. They were using the term duet on many occasions. And this executable was going to be saved in the disk and was going to be launched. There was even code written in Spanish, and in the end that executable was executed. So I tried to find who the author of this has been. This was my only clue, Cabaret, and it is a Russian singer. Obviously, I don't think this Russian singer was the author, but it was included in the code. I have several examples here. I think I loaded it before. Okay, it is not showing it. Can't I show it on the screen? Okay, it doesn't matter. We had some macros in which the code can be in which the code tries to detect if it is in Mac. Then it launches Python, but if it is in Windows, it launches PowerShell. It is not common, but it was also their objective, their target. So here it is. What we did was to... Oh, I can't see it right now. What we did was to create a macros. Oh, sorry, give me a second. I lost the focus, I'm sorry.
Vale, ahora sí, ahora sí. Sí. Nosotros hicimos algunas macros para ver.
We did some macros in order to see how easy it was for it not to be detected. This macros is quite catches your attention, it extracts all the information, sends the money, but this was not detected by antivirus. It's not a problem of antiviruses. It is quite complex to be detected. So we went far beyond. And in one macro, it could steal your office, so I could send this through Word, and it said, you are being robbed. And this macro took all the Skype database of conversation, and the attacker could download that information and see all your conversations. And the only thing that the victim did was to receive a document and open it. That Office document was created in just a few seconds, and it was unnoticed by antiviruses because it seemed normal. It wasn't difficult at all. One of the last ones is this macro. It is not common, but they have done it on several occasions. This macro, instead of downloading something malicious, was to download a compiler in order to compile a program in .NET in the system. And this one was encrypted, and the key to encrypt it was in a TXT document located in a DNS. It was the craziest things that I have seen, and it was using words, bug, sus, so very common words in variables, so that it had a normal appearance. One of the techniques which is quite used is the DOS obfuscation. It is quite fashionable right now. It is something you could do in Windows. You start injecting this little thing of the letter N, and you are executing a PowerShell without writing PowerShell. You take the P, the W, the O, and then you're typing PowerShell without typing it, because obviously that's going to be detected by antivirus. So they write different words and which are cut into small pieces. Another interesting one, also I have mentioned it earlier, is that the compiled code is stored as the source code is stored as well. This is quite good to analyze statically the macro by antiviruses. So they do this in case you open this document in an office with a non-updated engine, then they compile the source code and I execute macro. But what happens if we start typing anything in the source code, like a lot of zeros or ones? Nothing happens if the version matches. If the compiled code works in your office, nothing will happen. So attackers invented VPA stomping, where they delete the source code embedded in the macro, and they just used the compiled code. This is quite interesting and quite successful. Here I am going to launch a document with some techniques. In these two, we're going to see the macro of these documents. You see there are 5 macros with the code, with keys, different keys. If this same document, which is stomped, I mean, the macro source code has been deleted, there will be another macro which is quite difficult to understand. I stomped it with that. If we look at the code in depth, we will realize that what I have done is that where there were some keys, here you can read the source code, and here it is destroyed with added text. So VBA stomping has become quite popular, so much that a new tool, Evil Clippy, has been developed. I don't know if you remember Clippy. It looks like he is writing a letter, and it says, "It looks like your mad dog doesn't yet bypass AV. Do you want me to help you?" And this facilitates the VBA stomping action. It destroys the source code and it uses the compiled code. The template that makes a call so you can see the server. So there is a whole story about it, so that you cannot, you don't have to access the source code, and the attacker in the end can execute the macro.
Like most of the macros are unique macros, If you were wondering if they are reused, and there are statistics regarding unicity. Most of them are unique, only 20%, 25% are reused. Why? Because there are many obfuscations. So it is weird to find malicious macros which look the same. Also, other common characteristics regarding malware is the merging of 64-based chains, for example, hexadecimal chains. And also, this is something interesting regarding the time between creation of the document and last modification, which is less than 1 second. As this is completely automatized, these studies confirm what we already knew. Also, now regarding number of macros, they are usually 2, but this is also related to trends. When this study was done, only 1 macro was the most frequent value. And now regarding solutions, how is it possible that we are facing the same problem, that we've been facing the same problem for 20 years, and what can we do to avoid it? So here I have 5 different mitigations or solutions. I'm not going to explain this one because it is quite complex, but there are different formulas in order to enable the PowerShell logs. PowerShell and macros are very linked. So having good visibility of what's going on in the system PowerShell, what's being executed, allows you to learn about this. Regarding extension associations, we have to pay attention. Sorry, we don't have to trust the extension, the fact of being docked, docS. There is a tool called MEC that tells you if a document is a HTMA that thinks is a doc, that is faking or pretending to be a doc, or if it is a docM pretending to be a doc. This can be analyzed through this tool, a tool that associates the program, and regarding or using the magic number, not the extension. For example, it's safer to open RTF with WordPad than with Word, because probably an RTF wants to exploit the vulnerabilities that we've mentioned before. Also, we have to assess to check the use of ASR and trust in AMSI. If you are not using macros because you won't probably use them, you should disable them. And how can we do that? I mean, if you have a network, for example, the most simple thing to do is downloading these templates from this address, copying ADM X here, and then you have the option that says blocking the execution of macros. You click here, you enable this, and then your system is not going to execute macros. For example, at the level of active directories. This is quite useful. How can we make our system not to open certain type of documents such as 4.0 macros or similar extensions? Here in this configuration of Excel and Word, in the file blocking configuration, you can see that you can block all these files, and you can prevent that these documents with these extensions are opened or saved. It is highly unlikely that someone tries to send you a doc that it is an XML or something like that. All these documents that I've mentioned are formats that are not frequently sent, so you can block them here. And this is the same configuration of a Word document. Also, the 4.0 documents can be blocked here. Windows 10 to the rescue. Windows 10 is working on ASR. These are like recipes for specific problems. Only Windows 10 has these features, and it is under development. Some recipes work better than others, but there are several of them. You're not going to be able to learn this by heart, but you can try to get an overview. So for macros, Windows 10 offers to block all Office applications so that they don't create secondary processes. In order to block this type of malware, I mean, all malwares create child processes, but in order to avoid that, you can do this in PowerShell. I mean, this name is quite ugly right now, but it is a rule of attack reduction. You click enable and Office won't be able to open a child process as simple as that, but it is not very well known. And this is not similar to this one. I mean, this is something different, which is not allowing secondary processes. This is going to block functions such as shell, CMD, or calculator. However, this is not going to be able to stop WIMC. There is another ASR rule with a different number, which is called blocking API calls of Win32 from Office macros. We've seen the kernel 32 thing. That we cannot do that if we apply that. You are going to be deleting many macros, and these calls are not going to take place anymore if you do that. If you enable this, you are going to see that screen and you won't be able to open the file. And the last one, this is a rule which was quite recent. If you use that rule, you won't be able to call WMI rules. So with these three rules, you are going to delete all the basic functionalities of macros, and they won't be able to be executed. These resources won't be available anymore. This program is something that a little program that someone did, and that sometimes doesn't work, but it is quite useful. I'm launching the ASR rules from here. I can create an executable program. I'm going to launch that rule, and with enable, and here I will see that this is blocked. I'm going to create another rule. I'm going to launch another test in order to see if I can have executable programs from Office. Defender, stop this. Okay, so great. This is working quite well. You can test it if you want to. Also, memory is being widely used. Attackers create memory with PowerShell, with binary. So wouldn't it be wonderful to catch the malware in a memory? Antivirus cannot do that. But it happens that Microsoft has created someone called AMSI, which helps you scan the memory of PowerShell and scan it through Windows Defender. This is wonderful because it changes the whole antivirus paradigm that we already know. And it is quite innovative. Only Windows 10 offers that option. It is called AMSI, AMSI. Now it can only work for PowerShell. Well, recently it was also launched for Office 365. Everything done in the memory of Office 365 will also go through the memory. Go through Windows Defender, sorry, before touching the disk, before reaching the disk. And if you have this AMSI enabled, you can also call Mimikatz with PowerShell. Before Mimikatz reaches the disk, it's going to be cached only by doing the call. Here you can see that this happened before reaching the disk, if you have the AMSI enabled, and they are trying to extend it to other areas, not just PowerShell. So conclusions, macros never left us. They are back stronger than ever. I don't know if they will stay, because now Office 365 is going to be virtualized. Office is going to try to work on a completely virtual process. If they are able to do that with Office, then this problem won't exist anymore. Password compatibility is always a threat, and we have more formulas to defend ourselves than the ones that we think, even though we don't know them. Well, thank you very much. Are there any questions? Well, if you have any questions, I would like to invite you to ask, to talk to the speaker outside. We are running a little bit short on time, and we have to stick to the agenda today. But thank you so much for your presentation.